And so this week's presentation is from Nathan Johanning. He is a commercial agriculture educator for the University of Illinois Extension, located in Waterloo, Illinois, serving Madison, Monroe, and St. Clair counties. And he's been with Extension since 2013. Nathan has a broad background in both row crop and specialty crop production and specializes in weed, soil, and nutrient management, cover crops, and no-till production, along with being active on his family farm just south of Waterloo, where he raises a variety of specialty crops, including pumpkins. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nathan and let him get started.
All right. Thank you very much, Bronwyn. Everything's still looking good on your end?
Looks good.
All
We're
right.
ready to go.
Well, we'll jump right in. All right, so we're going to be talking today about some of the current research that I have ongoing on cover crops and no-till. So why are we looking at cover crops and no-till? Well, they have many benefits, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, and probably part of the reason why you're tuned in today, which we appreciate. So a lot of these benefits have to do with preventing erosion and managing our soils better, increasing the quality and health of our soils, and also the productivity of our farmland, trying to protect that, conserve nutrients, scavenge and produce them, along with providing habitats for beneficials, things of insects, pollinators, earthworms, and other microbes. They're all good guys out there that we're trying to preserve because we know that they have very valuable ecosystem services, and we need those. So there's all kinds of benefits to cover crops, which is why we put together this project to help investigate how we could better utilize cover crops in some of our vegetable production systems. So some benefits of no-till and cover crops in especially to vegetable production would be cleaner fruit, or fruit not lying directly on the soil. So this is something that is really evident, a lot of, especially of our ground growing crops, but even for tomatoes and peppers, I'm going to show you some examples of, those are going to be, have a lot of influence by the cleanliness. And of course, that's important for a lot of aspects, as far as certainly marketability, and even I think could even be tied back even possibly even to food safety and things, and reducing the amount of soil splash we have on fruit. So weed control, certainly there's an aspect of cover crops that can provide weed control to our cropping system. Nitrogen production, if you have legumes in there, so we can help to generate some of our own nitrogen in the system without having to add it through other amendments. Easier field access for harvest, especially during adverse weather conditions. I think this for our specialty crops is really crucial. On some of our more commodity cropping systems, where we plant and have a few field passes throughout the year, and then we have one harvest pass, I think things are a lot different. However, whenever we have a situation where we have most of these crops, we are getting, we're out in the field all the time. We're for tomatoes and peppers, think of the things we're out there. We planted them. We're doing pruning. We're staking. We're doing all kinds of things out in the field, harvesting multiple times. Then even just field cleanup later in the season. We are out in that field all the time, and we don't always have the flexibility of waiting. If you have a farmer's market on Saturday and it's Friday and it's raining and pouring, and you still have to get stuff harvested, I think no-till gives a huge benefit when it comes to the ability to work out in the field. And I think we noted that a lot especially in these plots, as you'll see. So it's less muddy after the rain, but you can go out in some of these fields that say no-till and a cover crop. You can go out and usually even in or right after a rain and hardly even have any mud on your boots. So that speaks a lot for this system and how you can get in there, and then even having less impact on the soil by compacting it whenever it's wet. So obviously a habitat for those beneficials, you know, buckwheat and clover certainly are all favor our pollinators, which are very important for most all of our specialty crops. Um, Preserving soil moisture. So that's another important thing. Reducing soil erosion and overall just improve soil health. So some benefits of production. So this is another aspect. So this is from our trial. We had conventional tillage, as you can see, versus no-till. This was some of our peppers in our early harvest. We had an extremely wet year, and we had you can see from this picture, our conventional tillage, we had all kinds of issues with, you know, a lot of soil splash. So this is just a good comparison in our no-till with our cereal rye, what some of our early fruits looked like on our peppers in those two systems. So certainly a really marked difference. And from there, heading on, you can also see that in this next slide, taking that after we get them into the basket, um, you can see that we have a lot cleaner fruit coming off of those no-till systems, with especially with the cereal rye cover. We also had some comparisons, plasticulture, which is also fairly clean. But anyhow, that just shows you more of what is really the benefits of some of these systems on more of a practical level even. All right, so on our no-till considerations, some things to keep in mind are that your residues, again, can be difficult to transplant into. We'll talk about that specialized equipment. And heavy residue can keep the soil wet during excessively wet weather at planting. That's something that can be managed, as I mentioned, but you just need to understand your soil type, understand your equipment and the biomass and your just individual field layout and topography. Also, there is a requirement of some additional management for just all these factors that happen to go together. Also, vole and mice, as I mentioned, can be problematic as well. So I want to jump in and just talk about some of the research trial, which is kind of the center of this presentation. So we had goals of evaluating how we could adapt cover crops and no-till into vegetable production systems. So we took on the crops of tomatoes and bell peppers. We did this in 2 years, or across 2 years in 2 locations. We've just started the first year and have that accomplished now. We have a Southern Illinois site, which is near my office in Waterloo at the Babbler Educational Farm. This is a light colored, well-drained forest soil, very rolling terrain. And to contrast that, we had a Central Illinois site. We had this at Urbana at our university farms. And of course, this would be a dark colored prairie soil and relatively flat terrain. We did this to have 2 contrasting environments so we could see under both of these soil types and conditions, which are predominant in Illinois, how these systems worked and performed. So our trial treatments, we have 7 main treatments here that we are evaluating across these 2 crops. We have Bareground, which is conventional tilled production. We have the Bareground that had a cover crop, which was then incorporated into the system. We had Plasticulture, and then we had Plasticulture with a cover crop. So again, this was a situation for both of these where the cover crop was grown, terminated and incorporated in, and then say plants are planted into tilled soil, and then also black plastic was laid. The last 3 treatments were all no-till treatments. We had a no-till that had no cover crop in it. Then we had a no-till with a cover crop, and it had a herbicide terminated and a herbicide program in that. And then we had a no-till with a cover crop but it was roller crimped only, no herbicide termination, and it had no herbicides in any of the in the treatments as far as synthetic products. So we had an organic weed management program for that treatment. So those are our 7 treatments, and you'll hear me refer to those throughout and give highlights of those in more details. So year 1 was this past year in 2020. Our cover crop was cereal rye. To test all these systems, we did not in this case branch out to other cover crops, which I think is a great opportunity for future research. However, we wanted to start by comparing all these systems and used one kind of unified common cover crop approach. So this was drilled into a tilled seed bed. The cover crop was in late October, early November. And from there, some notes on these treatments. So the cover crops that were going to be tilled, so that's in either Bareground or Plasticulture, were terminated with glyphosate at 18 to 24 inches tall in our case. You could certainly terminate with tillage or other ways. That was our chosen approach. And so we wanted to manage that residue so we didn't have so much residue that we had issues incorporating it and potential nitrogen tie-up and things to do a good job laying plastic and also a good job with tillage. All of our no-till cover crop treatments were rolled down for ease of planting and field operations. So even though we had a roller crimped only, even the herbicide treated one was still rolled down just so it was physically flat. With all of the field operations out there, it's just to us makes more sense to have that laying flat across all. The no-till treatments included a burn down herbicide, except for that last treatment, the roller crimped only. Again, it did not have, but the others did have a burn down herbicide. And all treatments, except for the no-till rolled crimp, that last one I mentioned, had dual magnum applied at planting. So that's on the Bareground Plasticulture that was applied at planting time to help suppress weeds between the rows. So other details are tomatoes. We use Red Deuce. The pepper was a Charisma. We were transplanted on the 3rd and 8th of June this past year for Waterloo and Urbana respectively. We had been rained out by a very wet period in the mid to later part of May. And so that was where it was as soon as we could get out there, even though it was a little behind of our target. But as with everyone else, we are all subject to the weather and have to work with it. So all plots were managed for insects and diseases and also fertilized and fertigated equally. So we kept all those other things equal. The last treatment, we used organic weed management, but we did not use organic management overall because we did not want that to be kind of a confounding factor in just testing these cover crop treatments, which is really our true goal for this specific research project. We manage weeds through various means: mowing, spraying, and hand weeding in all plots, depending on the specific treatment and being respectful for the methods that we wanted to use in those. Our plots were 80 feet by 10 feet wide. So within that plot, one row had 30 feet of tomatoes at a 2-foot spacing, and then had 30 feet of peppers at a 1-foot spacing. So within that showed that's so effectively what we had there. We had 15 tomato plants and then 30 pepper plants in each plot. The yield data was collected from the center 20 feet of the plot, trying to buffer out any maybe edge effects of the treatments. And with that, so that gives us 10 tomato plants and 20 pepper plants that were represented in that. And you'll see also when we see some yield data later, you'll see that it's represented per plot. And I have that listed if it's per 10 plants or per 20 plants. So with that, our harvest, we harvested 6 harvests for tomatoes on a weekly basis and 3 harvests every other week for our bell peppers. So going through the season, this was cover crop planting for both of our sites. This also gives you a little bit of the idea of the terrain and what is kind of the situation. Obviously, our darker soils versus lighter soils. And so that was just that's getting started planting our cover crops in our trials. So jumping ahead towards things of springtime, this is our roller crimper that we had with this project. So this was what we used for those that may haven't seen a roller crimper. This is what we used for terminating the cover crop, especially in that roller crimped only, but we also used it on any of the cover crop no-till treatments to help lay that cover crop down. There's some things to note about this style of roller crimper versus just any old roller is that the blades on it having that chevron or kind of V shape to them, that rather than just hitting that stem as it rolls, it gives a slight twist, and that's kind of what gives us that actual crimping action. So that's where a roller crimper does something different than just a regular roller. It's using those bars to break the stem. And also with that, we also fill that roller with water to give added weight, because you need good contact for those blades on those stems to get it to lay down, but also, again, you're trying to physically break the stem. So this was, we're here, this was at our Waterloo site, and we are doing our roller crimping, and I'll just give you a little example of exactly how that worked. Well, it appears as if my video clips are not going to be cooperative today. So what you would have seen is a roller crimper going through the field. And basically, as it goes through the field, again, we have water in it. It is laying that cover crop down, and then lays it down flat and gives you a much nicer cover crop bed to work in, and it's breaking those stems so that way you have that stem broken. Now notice we wait until almost maturity for this. So with this, in this system, what we have to do is we have to wait until flowering or anthesis. So we wait until there's actually been, the grain is flowered. At that point, the plant has switched from a vegetative state where it's trying to grow stems to focusing on seed production. The reason we wait is that at that point, whenever we do this, we have very limited regrowth from our cereal rye. So that is something where we have a lot of an issue with, say, using a roller crimper, is that we do have to be very specific. You can't just roll down cereal rye, for example, at any point in time and expect to get complete death of it. So that is something that is very important to know. And with that, we're also timing it before at anthesis or flowering. We can also catch it in a window before we have any viable seed produced. So there's a happy spot we can prevent reseeding, but we can also will have it such that we don't have any issues with having any other reseeding and creating a weed problem. All right, so how roller crimping works. For this case, for roller crimping, we have a case, and what you'll see kind of where my hand is at in this, you can see that we have the stem broken right there. And so usually we would break that stem in at least 3 different places. And this will basically, what this does is effectively disconnects the head and stem from the root system of the plant by breaking all of that nutrient flow between them. And so that is a really important aspect of this, and how that mechanism actually works. So this is what you end up with after you roller crimp. So this gives you an idea of what we're planting into. This is where we have all that residue laid down. And this is just looking down. This is a snapshot of what kind of level of residue we have on this. So how are we going to plant? This is our no-till planter that we had, our no-till transplanter. So in this, you can see we have, this is set up, it's a traditional transplanter, but it has some specific features on it that allow it to handle residue, such as a no-till coulter, subsoiler tooth, double disc openers, flat packing wheel, and also some accessories to add some weight to help with closing of the trench. So this is what we used, and you'll see some images of this as we refer to how we plant. So this presentation, I don't have a ton of time to dip into all of the details of no-till transplanting, but if you go to our local food systems and small farms YouTube channel, I put together a making a no-till transplanter work for vegetable crops video, which basically outlines the whole system of going through all of this and trying to, if you're trying to build a transplanter, what are those key components I mentioned, some action shots of it working. And so that's a little bit of kind of background and added resource that you can go to. And certainly you can always reach out to me for more information. I've helped countless people now with transplanter issues, but that is that video I feel is a nice kind of compilation of some of my thoughts as far as managing no-till and transplanting. So as you, this is a shot then of, as you go through the field, this is what you're starting with, and you're starting again with that, having that no-till coulter and subsoiler tooth. This image is actually when we use the transplanter for some pumpkin work later in the season, but this is, again, that video gives you some action shots and gives you the full aspect of what's going on there.
Hey, Nathan.
Yes.
Could you do just a real quick recap on the time of year that the cover crops were planted, and then the timing when you terminated prior to the transplanting in the spring?
Sure,
Just real quick.
I can do that. No, so again, all these cover crops were planted late October or early November of the year prior. So in this case, it was in November, early or late October of 2019. And so and then in the spring of 2020, we terminated. In this case, we shot for the end thesis, or when that was kind of our target for managing the no-till treatments. The others, again, I mentioned, the tilled treatments for those, we sprayed those ahead of time when they were 18 to 24 inches tall, which if you haven't experienced cereal rye, you would know that occurs very quickly. It stays very short, but in a matter of less than, I would say, a month, it goes from being maybe 6 inches tall to 4 or 5 feet tall. So that there's a very period of very rapid growth. And so with this past year, of course, the rain and weather influenced things a little bit on us, but termination was probably around the last part of May, I would say, somewhere around the 25th or so of May, give or take a little bit. I think it was a touch later in Urbana, being a little further north, but that was around the timing in this season where we terminated.
Thank you.
Sure. And as you see, this is a picture of our Waterloo site. Shortly after termination, we had the cover crops laid down. You can see that we had done at least the primary tillage on our tillage plots. You can still see some of the cover crop tilled plots. You notice maybe a little bit of residue in there. So we hadn't done our final tillage and hadn't laid any plastic yet, but that was our setting for that. Planting, this was actually a picture of our maiden voyage with this transplanter specifically, and actually working on some of the border rows. So you can see all the residue that we have there. And so we're getting ready to set the first plants. This was again at our Waterloo site. You can see off in the edge here, you can see we have, in this case, there's a conventional tillage plot beside us. So we have that all tilled and laid down. So that was all set and ready to go. So this is just a snapshot of Urbana, gives you different perspective, different site, and kind of a different perspective of the trial. So here, this is actually right after planting at Urbana. You can see as you work from left to right, you can see a couple of the tillage plots and then 2 plasticulture plots. And then there is a no-till and our with and with cover crop, and then our roll crimp treatment. So, and you can see as those repeat throughout the plot with the different replications. So that's just a little snapshot to kind of give you an idea throughout the season what this looked like. This was planting at Urbana. This was in one of the cover crop plots. So we're transplanting in there in action, going through one of those strips. As you can see, we have a no-till on one side and a plasticulture treatment on the other. And this is after transplanting. So this is that same day. This is the peppers. You can see the row of peppers. The tomatoes would be in the back half. You don't really notice them as much in this, but that's basically what we are looking at. Again, this was at the Urbana site. So now I just have some snapshots. These are all from the Waterloo site that I'm using. So we have 2 different dates. We have one that's roughly a little over a month after transplanting. And then we have another one that comes in about a month or so, a little over a month after that. So we have July 10th and August 18th, where we have these 2 snapshots. So these are the same plot. Just a time separation, so you can kind of get at least a glimpse of how these treatments performed and kind of how they look throughout the season. So as you can see, the Bareground, you can see in this case, we did have a few weed escapes coming in. This is before the July treatment that you see here was pictures taken before we did anything to manage weeds. It was kind of a snapshot before we had done lots of hand weeding or anything. So you could just see just alone how these treatments were comparing. We had some water hemp. Note that a lot of this water hemp that you see kind of a row of water hemp actually fell where the tire tracks from the tractor and transplanter was in that fairly loose soil. So in that case, I think there's better seed to soil contact. Despite there being a herbicide down, you still had a little better germination of some of those weeds in that situation. We did, as you see later, we had cleaned up those weeds via some hand weeding and things, so you don't notice those as much later. You will see in some of these plots the green that's kind of on the ground, and the August picture here, we had lots of carpet weed, which is a very common weed that you have in field and vegetable production crops. Very low growing. It actually, some of the later pictures, it kind of took over some of the treatments for, especially along some of the edges of the plastic and things. We didn't really manage it and just left it, mainly because it's a little harder to control, and it was actually providing us some service as far as erosion management at the Waterloo site. So we later in the season we went ahead and left that. So it's a few notes, but you can see Bareground with a cover crop. Again, doesn't look a whole bunch different. I think if you look very closely, you could see a little bit, maybe some residue, and if you had an up close version of the picture, and especially the July picture of some residue still that had been incorporated. Again, interesting, just kind of side note, you can see, especially on that July picture, very clearly, you can see that tire track from the transplanters that basically straddled the row whenever we transplanted. So interesting how that influenced some of our weed management in this case. But was something that we managed and cleaned up. Again, good production then later as we got into the harvest season. Our plasticulture treatments, again, same story here. I think we had good growth. And then also, as you see later, you can see I mentioned some of that carpet weed, especially growing along the edge of the plastic. In this case, as I mentioned, that did help to slow down some of the water that can cause erosion, which I'm sure any of you that have had plasticulture on any little bit of a slope know some of the erosion issues that you can get because you're shedding all of that water. So our plasticulture with a cover crop, again, looks, very similar at this point. Of course, the cover crop influence isn't something that you're physically seeing because it's been incorporated. But certainly, even though you're not seeing the difference now, note the goal of this system in this and the Bareground with a cover crop is, can we still use this to help preserve our soil over the winter and help hold it, even though we still are going to use these tillage systems during the year? Can we gain that cover crop benefit in the off season without giving any sacrifices to our crop production system? So again, good production there, good in growth. Our straight no-till. So here you can see again, especially earlier in the season, you can see some of the kind of remaining residue that was there from over winter. And so that was, you can distinctly tell that from, say, in this case, the tillage plots, which you could see on either side and see the differences there. Certainly, I mentioned the soil splash earlier. Even just straight no-till, because the soil had not been worked, didn't have as much of the erosion and soil splash issues because there was more stability and structure to that soil. So it wasn't splashing, it wasn't moving quite like it would be in something that's been very finely worked. All right, our no-till cover crop with a herbicide. So this, you can see, this was kind of our, I think would be kind of a conventional standard practice for utilizing a cover crop and no-till. So in this case, we had really good weed control earlier, especially early in the season. We had worked with between, in this case, the herbicide and the rye residue together, brought a lot of value to that system and keeping it clean and free of weeds. Certainly, there were still some weeds in there, and we did some selective hand weeding, but certainly I think we saw fairly good results and management, all things considered, with this treatment, not having to have any a lot of extra effort for weed management. Next, we had our no-till cover crop that was rolled. So this did not have any herbicide treatments applied to it. And so this one, you can see we do have some weeds coming in. This is a good example of what our pre-emergent herbicide, our dual magnum, did, along with, of course, a burn down herbicide. But these plots were fairly clean of weeds. There weren't really a lot of weeds in the understory of the cereal rye. The rye did a very good job of suppressing the weeds while it was growing. But certainly, and especially when that rye is laid down, if there's gaps in the residue and things, you can start to see some escaped weeds that will come in. Again, on the July picture is before we had done any management, so no hand weeding or mowing at this point. But for this treatment, hand weeding along the row, especially, and then some other, say some large water hemp or other things in the row middles, we would pull out. The rest we just manage with mowing, using like a mulching deck or rear discharge type mower. So now I want to go ahead and just jump into some of the yield data, so we can talk about some of that. For Waterloo, you can see, I have just to lay out these slides before we jump into these. This was our tomato data from Waterloo. Our treatments are all listed on the left side. So we had Bareground with cover, Plasticulture with and without cover, our no-till with cover and herbicide, and then no-till, cover, and rolled. So I tried to be very consistent with the order of them. You'll see I do have statistics for these. So anything that has the same letter beside it would not be statistically different from anything else. So if it has an A beside it, it's not different from anything that has an A. Likewise, if it has a B beside it, it isn't different with anything with a B. And there is some overlap. So when you see an A and a B together, that would be the same as both letters with A and B. So we also did list there's an LSD, which basically means that's the least significant difference. So in order to be statistically different or show up as different letters, that one number would have to be at least in, say, for example, of fruit weight would have to at least in this slide have to be at least 16.4 pounds or greater different to be different. Statistically, given all the variation between plots and things that was accounted for. So as you can see here, for tomatoes, we again, all these yields are per 10 plants for tomatoes. So we had for all these treatments, the fruit number really didn't vary. We did have differences in fruit weight, which also translated a little bit into fruit size. So we did have some differences there, fairly subtle, but we did see that. What you can see in bold for all these slides is when we did have significant differences, anything that is bolded is not significantly different from the highest yields that we achieve. So basically all of the things that were listed with an A are in bold. I did that just to give us a little bit of a parameter of saying, all right, so all these treatments, perform similarly. So in this case, basically, despite some numerical differences, we had no yield statistical differences within anything except for the straight no-till, which was slightly lower than what our plasticulture would be. But certainly, what I see from this, we had competitive yields, and our no-till systems were, with a cover crop, were able to hold their own with all of our other conventional systems. Likewise, adding that cover crop into these systems of Bareground or plasticulture did not, didn't provide any issues or didn't give us any, yield drag, as some would say, in our grain crop systems. So we were still able to grow a very good crop, even just with using that cover crop over the winter to help improve our soil. So looking at our yields at Urbana for tomatoes, again, same layout, just some different numbers. So in this case, at Urbana, we did have differences in our marketable fruit numbers. This is per 10 plants. I do want to make a note here in the overall differences in yield. At the Urbana site, were hit with a hailstorm about 2 weeks or so before our first harvest, which damaged a lot of our fruit. And on top of that, they have a very robust flock of crows that loves to hang around the fruit farm where this was at. And they took a specific liking to the tomatoes. The peppers, I don't think they bothered much at all, but they did cause a lot of injury to the fruit. And so we did our best to help manage and mitigate that and still collect good data. However, I think that did pull down our yield, and I think the hailstorm certainly took out a lot of some of the earlier fruit harvest. So that's just a note on maybe some of the difference between in total yields in both of these sites. But as you can see, as far as our leaders here, our plasticulture and Bareground, and then also our no-till with our cover and herbicide all performed as well as our premium treatment here, which in this case was the plasticulture. So those all perform similarly. And within that, even looking within Bareground and plasticulture and within no-till systems, the addition or lack of a cover crop didn't have any distinct differences in yield. So that was as far as fruit number. Fruit weight, story is fairly similar. So again, plasticulture gave us our weights in the highest range again, but our plasticulture treatments, especially our plasticulture with cover, wasn't really different than any of our Bareground or our no-till that had a cover crop in it. All right, so now moving on to our pepper data. So for this, we had, for our peppers, we had, again, very good yields, especially at Waterloo. I think our yields were exceptional. The yields are per 20 plants, as you can see from that 20-foot section of row we harvested. So for these treatments, fruit number are all of our conventional systems, Bareground and Plasticulture did very well. We saw no differences by per se of incorporating that cover crop. So that was another good confirmation that we can do that very adequately. Also, our no-till with a cover crop and herbicide did very well. So we have very good performance there, um, and so that was very comparable with all of our treatments and systems. So that did very well. In this case, we did have you'll see our roll cover crop had some challenges there, and with our yields, and even straight no-till. So one of the things that we noticed, and I didn't point it out in the picture on our rolled cover crop, is we noticed later in the season that these plants were a little bit more pale. And so that got progressively worse. It actually showed up first in Urbana in the darker soils, which surprised me a little bit. But we did very well otherwise. But certainly as the season went on, that got a little bit progressively worse. Because we were holding all things equal, fertility, we did not go in to say if it was nitrogen related. We didn't increase the nitrogen rate because we didn't want that to be an influencing factor. So we held all things the same, but they were fertilized, and so there's certainly no factor in there that would lead to that makes obvious sense. There's also some weed pressure, even though mowed. So I'm curious, and that's another thought I have for the future, is how to investigate some of the nuances of that system and what's going on there. But overall, I think yields were very good across the conventional treatments with or without a cover crop, and then that no-till with our cover crop and our herbicide system. So going to Urbana, I think actually your story is very similar to a certain extent. So we have again our bolded items. So within fruit number and weight, we had no differences here for fruit number on any of these treatments in the plasticulture or the no-till with or without a cover, and with the herbicide program. But with our fruit weight, again, we did actually have to have that our plasticulture with a cover actually did perform better than what our no-till with the cover and herbicide. So we had just barely did have a difference there. But overall, lots of very robust growth. I will say on this one, fruit size, for whatever it may be, even though our yields weren't as good, we did see a higher fruit size in the Bareground with a cover compared with some of the others. So, and again, the last thing I want to mention on this is our no-till cover with the roll cover and no herbicide. Again, that yield-wise fell down lower. In this case, fairly significantly lower than the others. We still did get yield, and the fruit quality wasn't too bad. Slightly smaller in this case, but again, trying to one of my goals in the future is trying to determine where to go from here and on that treatment and what is different. Because between those two treatments and what's causing that. So that's an interesting thing that we learned and want to try to investigate more on. So our summary of these treatments is that I think the addition of a cover crop to any of these systems can be a viable production practice. Of course, with any of these systems, we have different crops, we have different conditions, and so we're still trying to, they're not all, unfortunately, going to fall out just identical to another as far as how treatments react. So our goals are now to, see what we've learned and try to apply that and how we can refine these systems even further. Our no-till production with cereal rye can achieve comparable yields to other systems. So, so we have multiple instances here with these different treatments this season that we had those cereal rye would compete sometimes as plasticulture very well, but certainly a lot of times with the Bareground systems were very competitive. and in most of our situations and at most of our sites. So, even looking at this again, like I've mentioned before, we've also seen that you can incorporate this cover crop into your overwintering system, even though plasticulture has lots of advantages, and I'm not certainly trying to knock that, but we can add a cereal rye cover crop over the winter, help it to build and preserve the soil over the winter, and yes, still do our tillage and manage it appropriately to have a good plasticulture crop and still get good yields out of that. So cover crop and plasticulture both do keep our fruit cleaner than bare ground. This was just observations. We certainly didn't have any data we attempted to collect on this, but certainly in a wet season, that was one thing to note, especially on the peppers. We even did at the Waterloo site did try to wash a few of the peppers, some, but certainly without a wash line or something. It certainly is more challenging. It's certainly way easier just to have clean fruit coming out of the field to start with versus having to rely on some of our washing systems or other things quite as heavily. Cover crops and nutrient management is crucial for optimal yields. So certainly, we need to understand some of these differences in management needed for these systems. I've addressed some of these things. So and if incorporating your cover crops, and if it's cereal rye, my thought is, you need to be at or less than 24 inches is my goal for trying to terminate it. And that could be that you're just disking it down. It doesn't have to be a herbicide pass. You could mow it. Do some kind of a mower that you would chop up the residue very fine and then incorporate it depending on the aggressiveness of your tillage equipment. But either way, I think, and we've seen this in many other crops, try to, not let that cereal rye get 5 feet tall and then try to incorporate it and expect to have, perfect results without some other interactions there. So future plans. So of course, this is just year one. Year two will hopefully give us a better understanding. I put hopefully because as those have done research know, not everything works and the data doesn't always crunch out as easily as you would like, but we're hopeful that we'll at least see a different season and perspective. Hopefully we'll see some trends that are similar. And if not, we'll compare seasons and maybe understand how under different weather patterns these systems work. So that's all the point of viewing different locations and different years to understand how these systems work for everyone. So I want to understand more of those challenges I mentioned with that rolled system without a herbicide. So is it nitrogen immobilization occurring? Is it weed competition? Is there some hybrid approach there? But it was very pronounced, and anyone for the few those that helped me out in the field know that you could see it very clearly in that case. So another thing we want to do is calculate the differences in inputs and management cost as we wrap up the trial. So certainly the labor and effort and equipment to lay plastic should be considered compared with seeding a cover crop and making those passes. And where do some of the economics lie in some of these systems? So that's where we want to show that so we can think about this from a holistic standpoint in what does it really cost us to add a cover crop into a system, or how does the no-till system compare for production cost compared with some of the others. So in 2021, look to hear more about these trials and some on-farm demonstrations with the transplanter and no-till systems. So I will make a little bit of a plug now that I have a limited number, and we'll probably have a plea for this more in the future, but we do have some opportunities. If there was one or two growers around the state that had some cereal rye planted and they wanted to demonstrate some systems like this, feel free to contact me. I have a few things lined up, but I do have opportunities within this project to do some more. So my contact information will be coming up here. So if you're watching this live and have an interest in that, certainly we can reach out one-on-one and see if that would be an opportunity. Acknowledgements. In general, I want to thank the Illinois Department of Agriculture through their specialty crop block grant program. We did receive a grant to fund all this and help to support this equipment. and all this research to bring that to you. Without all that support, we would not be able to have this. Certainly, also thanks to the Badler Educational Farm and the university farms, all of their input and help has been very beneficial. Also, specific individuals within there, Maddie Heebner, who you see pictured behind with her very proud of her large tomato harvest. She was our intern and actually should be helping us again this next season. Did an amazing job, learned a ton about staking, tying, and harvesting tomatoes and bell peppers, probably more than she wanted to some days. Jeremy Schaefer and Brian Warsaw both work up on campus and were instrumental in conducting that Urbana trial. Elizabeth Wally, also my colleague, helped out a lot with shooting videos, taking pictures, help with planning and things. Susan Rick, Mike McClimate, and then Wayne Johanning were also ones that all helped at the Waterloo site with just more kind of volunteer help with planting and even some harvest and things. Also, locally, we have Cliff Schutte, Schutte Seeds, provided us with the cover crop seed, and then Kevin Hosey from Seedway provided us the vegetable seeds for these trials. So in wrapping up, what can cover crops do on your farm? Remember that these are long-term benefits. They aren't just something that is just going to instantly have an effect. If you want to really embrace this, do it over the long haul, and you will see the benefits. And certainly there's a couple of presentations we can get into on beyond what we've discussed today along that. No matter your production system, I think there's opportunities to add cover crops and reduce tillage. And I think you've seen that and showed that through some of this research, that adding that cover crop in any of these systems can be a viable approach. And remember that soil health can go a long ways in promoting that healthy crop. So one thing that I wanted to kind of wrap up with today is just looking at some of the erosion influences that we have in some of these different systems. So this image here doesn't give you the full picture of really what is going on, but in this case, what you can see is that we have these tillage treatments and plasticulture treatments here. If you look right on the front corner, you will see that we have, there's some cereal rye that was here, and that cereal rye strip should go all across the bottom part of that picture, and you can see a little bit of it, but we had such a wet season. We had so much erosion coming off of these tillage plots and plasticulture plots, even though we only had probably 2 or 3% slope across this side of the field, fairly slight compared to many fields. We had a huge amount of erosion, but note right at the front of this picture, note that line and where that cereal rye was, that cereal rye strip right beside it, I would say there's almost zero soil movement. So that was a really eye-opening kind of observation that I think really puts a different perspective to this work and how it can be applied, and the benefits that we don't think of. When you have a whole field of plasticulture, sometimes I think it's easy to not realize just how much soil is moving. But this was just from 80 feet. There was a rye strip up at the front end of those peppers, and this all down at the bottom was rye, and all that is a couple inches of sediment that's washed across it with a heavy rain event. So the last thing I want to mention here is make a plug for the Illinois Fruit and Vegetable News. So this is an online newsletter that myself and Bronwyn Ailey helped to organize and edit. And with the help and contributions of all of our extension educators from around the state, we have regional updates and lots of pest and production information. And so you can see the information. Certainly send myself or Bronwyn a note if you want to be added to the email list to get an email each month whenever this comes out. We do have paper subscriptions available, and you can contact us as well to find out about how to get a hold of that. I also make a plug is that I have constantly been sharing updates throughout the season on these trials and things like this whenever they occur. So that keeps, if you want to kind of know, especially in 2021, how things are going with the trial, certainly look for updates. Anytime I have video updates that I've shot from the trials, those links are always included in there as well. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your participation today. And certainly a note that the QR code for the survey you'll see posted up on the corner of the screen here. So you can hover over that if you want for direct access to that survey. And with that, I know there's lots of activity in the chat box. So Bronwyn, if you would please help me wade through some of that. So.
Yep, I will do that. So one of the questions that we had, it's kind of a two-part question. With your experience with the roller crimper and using it on mixed cover crops versus just the single one that with the cereal rye that you've done in this trial, what experience do you have with using that crimper in a mix, like say a rye vetch mix, or even other types of green manure cover crops, and how it works on those?
So with that, I would say the biggest thing, because with any cereal rye or even any of your broadleaves, you really are hitting about that same timing. Most of these will flower in some fashion. So if you can you're hitting that timing. And when you have multiple cover crop species, sometimes it is a challenge to get the flowering timing to line up just right, so that way you're hitting it appropriately. I know I've worked some with, say, cereal rye and crimson clover together. That's one combination, and that, because of the flowering timing is kind of aligned, that can work fairly well. And the nice thing with both of those crops is that they're both winter annuals that are naturally going to die anyhow. If for some reason you have a crop that is not a winter annual that has more potential to continue to grow, that is so some of our perennial clovers and things, that's a completely different story. So the short of it is, without going on a specific detail basis, is that you can crimp multiple species together. Sometimes there are some challenges there. And a lot of it depends on the species, but again, you're trying to line it up so your flowering is kind of coincides there. Some people will, you can roll crimp and they still maybe include a herbicide of some fashion in the system. That can be a nice insurance tool just to help and make sure you don't have regrowth, because regrowth, especially on some of our specialty crops, can be very frustrating. But certainly, aside from a roller crimper, other mechanisms that I've used in cover crops for termination is also like a disc mower or a sickle mower. If you happen to have an old one of those around or can find one, the residue isn't still attached, so sometimes it'll want to move around, but that's a good way to lay it down and still have lots of residue and not chop and pulverize the residue like, say, a regular lawnmower would, or a bush hog or type implement. So hopefully that gives some perspectives there. So what else do we have, Bronwyn?
We had another question asking whether maybe soil compaction could be an influence on the difference that was seen between the rolled and the unrolled.
So from the perspective of, so one thought on that is that, remember that, so both the rolled only treatment and the herbicide treatment actually were rolled with the roller. So there wasn't necessarily a difference in, say, traffic of the roller. And actually, sometimes you would think that maybe that roller would be an implement of high compaction. It doesn't really, because of those chevron patterns and how it rolls and that it's going over the residue, it isn't as big of a influence for compaction creation as what one might think it would be from at a first glance. I would actually argue your tractor tires still probably do more compaction than what the roller crimper does. So, but one thought we did have is there were some cases where the the no-till without a cover crop didn't do quite as well as we would hope. And so I am curious if maybe there, maybe from intensive tillage in the past, if there wasn't some compaction there that the cereal rye cover crop did alleviate a little bit. Whereas without a cover crop in no-till, we had a little bit tighter soils that weren't seen. So, but I don't think that they were between, say, the herbicide rolled and the no herbicide rolled. I don't feel like compaction in that case would be a major difference or issue.
Okay. And then we had two or three other questions that came in, and I think you may have addressed those in your final slide, talking about future plans. One of them was looking at kind of a cost analysis of the treatments, to see if the potential higher cost of the different treatments is justified with the amount of yield increase. But I think you talked about in your making those economic comparisons after year two, I believe.
Yeah. After year two, we're going to do a more thorough analysis and kind of gather some of that information. Yep.
And then also to follow up with that, there was a question that asked, would you expect yield to change dramatically from just 1 year? What does this look like after a couple of years of treatment strategies? And I think this is where we replicate over 2 years and look at comparisons between seasons.
Yeah, I think that's very, yeah, I would agree with that. And certainly in this case, I will say we are not putting this trial exactly back on the same plots and same places year after year. We did this more as to see, if you just went in and did no-till one season, which I could, argue with myself is not necessarily the best approach. Long-term, or no-till is really a long-term approach, as I mentioned. However, there's only so many things in research that you can accomplish. And so ideally, I would love to have an opportunity to do another trial where we could actually set up long-term, tillage and no-till rotations and see how that it would influence with, better crop rotation. And so, but that obviously, I know Bronwyn, that gets to be a lot of work in a hurry. That's not a simple project, but certainly those are really valid questions. And I think, like you mentioned, there was a mention of compaction issues. Long-term no-till sometimes from a rough perspective might seem as if it's more, maybe there's more compaction because the soil seems more firm, but really most of the time what you're seeing is you see better structure to the soil. Mother Nature is far better at creating soil structure than your rototiller is. So that's, but no, those are some great things that I hope in some fashion in the future we can test, especially on a longer term situation, how these systems perform.
Okay. And then the only other question that I think I haven't brought it to your attention yet, but I think Zach did a really good job of I think covering it in the sharing some links in the chat, was there was a question on whether you had any experience with flattening or using some type of roller crimper on a smaller scale, not in a field setting with the tractor. And Zach shared some links from a couple of sources that he found.
Sure, and I haven't used, so the one we have in this trial is a 10.5 foot, which is a common smaller size. I know that for vegetable production that seems probably pretty big, but they do make smaller versions. The biggest thing I would just say from worked with various roller crimpers is that remember that that chevron or some kind of patterning there is important, and then also weight is important. You don't want to that weight is crucial to actually getting that crimp to occur as it needs to. So
okay, and I think I've covered all the questions that I think I saw in the chat.
Bronwyn, there was one question related to the cost of each treatment, trying to get at whether slightly better yield justified by the higher cost for herbicide application or cover crop seed.
Yeah, I talked to him about.
Oh, okay, cool.
That already. Yep, we found that one too. So I think that covers all of the questions in the chat. So Thank you, Nathan. Really appreciate it. This was a fabulous presentation, and we want to thank you for sharing your insights into incorporating cover crops and no-till into tomato and pepper production. I also want to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar. Thanks for helping us kick off the 2021 Small Farm Winter Webinar Series. And we hope that you got some information that will help you in your small farm endeavors, and hopefully even something that you might still be able to put in place yet this winter. Please look for an email from Zach with a link to the archived webinar that will be shared on our Illinois Local Foods YouTube channel, as well as a very short evaluation of the webinar that you just watched. I believe the QR code will take you to that, as well as Zach, I think, shared the link in the chat multiple times to the survey as well. We do look for your feedback, and we use it to shape our future webinars. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to fill out that survey. Yeah, Zach just posted it again too. And so with that, I want to wish everybody a great day, and we will see you next week.